Hi, so welcome to lecture 5B. It's kind of the second part of the lecture, but it comes back to the same material. Just to remind you, I've consolidated these lectures so instead of going through the topics as we had them in the schedule, and I'll send you out a copy of the new schedule, I've moved everything related to assignment 2 up to the front, and so we're doing class and race and gender again in more depth. And then there's a couple of other topics you would need to cover in some of your advanced courses. So I'm going to do those, and they're less directly related to that assignment 2. Important, but not necessarily don't necessarily feed directly into that. And because of the sort of awkward holiday around Christmas and everything, I wanted to get as much of the the topics, the specific information for those topics out in front of you. So this is 5B. This is about class again, and about health and some discussion of suicide. Of course, you've got your topic outlines on the website to go through it in more detail. So it's there. Same with the other topics, but here we'll talk about class and health this time. So I'll give you another look at that class question and marks, and who was originally a topic that I've consolidated into this lecture and into a later one on the state, so that we don't multiply. Can we compress it into an easier format in relation to the assessment? So in this lecture we're looking at a class, as I said, and we've talked about it in the earlier lectures, in the first few weeks of the course and in the last lecture, but I want to expand it here and look particularly at Marx's notion of class. Now I regard Marx as the Darwin of the social sciences, so whether you agree or disagree, he's still something you need to know. Just like if you were learning theories of evolution, you would learn about Darwin. Of course, a lot of things have happened since the 1850s, but Darwin and Marx were contemporaries. Then in developing how we think about things, but we'll try and look at some of that theory. Then we'll look at a big area, which is sociology of health and illness. It's the theme of the school that we're in, and then we'll look at the critique of the biometric model and its limitations, especially in dealing with depression and suicide. What is the cultural common sense about class? Well, there's a few, and they're quite contradictory. The dominant discourse is that Australia is a egalitarian society. It has been since its formation, based on mateship and fairness and fair go for everybody. And in that sense, it's a classless society. And that was particularly the case in the early days when we didn't have the sort of class hierarchies that you saw in Britain with a clear aristocracy and the king and so on. The class divisions weren't so clearly marked in Australian society, even in the early days. They were there with different uniforms and so on, and clearly the convicts and the officers and so on. But that gave rise to a culture where everybody is seen as middle class. It's strange because if you ask people, 86% of people will tell you that Australia is a class society, so they do understand that it's not really classless, but that is also paired with the idea that everybody is middle class, which is another way of saying that there is no classes if there is only one class. And if you look at that, click on that Crikey report there, you'll see that it's done some survey work on how different income earners see the class hierarchy. Strangely, it concludes that it's all subjective as well, that it all depends on where you are in the hierarchy, how you see class. But I think we can do better than that. But 50% of people, even on the lowest incomes, 50% on average said that everyone was middle class, and those on the lowest incomes still said that they were middle class. So we have this sort of distorted perception of what class means, but those subjective ideas of it being subjective kind of dominate. We have other discourses. Everyone thinks that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and that captures a part of the dynamic of capitalism. And more recently in the press we've seen this notion that the Labor Party is engaged in some sort of class warfare, that it's trying to steal the rich's money and give it to the poor or something like that. But perhaps redistributing money upwards doesn't seem to be class warfare, but any attempt to redistribute it downwards is immediately labelled class warfare, and there's that sort of rhetoric floating around. So it's interesting to sort of think about the meanings around that. So if I put this list in front of you and I put it on the Moodle site, I mean, how many of these names do you know? And some of them you've probably heard in the media recently. And Gina Reinhardt certainly has been in the media. Anthony Forrest, probably Clive Palmer because he's a bit of a local. Packers, you probably know James Packer and his father Kerry, because they're associated with the media. But I wonder about the others, how many you know, and who they are, and why they're in a top 10 list. And the answer is because they're the Business Review Weekly Rich List. And so we see here I've filled in the details, what their net worth is. So Gina Reinhardt's family's worth about $10 billion. She owns Hancock Prospecting. Her father was a mining prospector. Ivan Glassenberg is a commodities trader. He's supposed to be worth $8 billion. Andrew Forrest, from Fortescue Metals. Andrew Patt owns Visy Industries. So that's all the cardboard and things that everything is packaged in, like your milk and so on. Those cardboard packaging. Clive Palmer, we probably know. Frank Lowy was the first person to build Westfield shopping centres in Australia in the late 60s. Treaty Bob owns Meriton Apartments. Packer, of course, is casinos and the media. John Gandel owns shopping centres, and Chris Wallen's another coal baron. So it's interesting, I think, that there you're talking about the richest and in some sense the most powerful people in Australia, and yet very few of us know who they are. So that's an important aspect of class. And when we're talking about millions or billions in the case of this group of people, we just have to sort of remind ourselves that average weekly earnings is $50,000 a year in Australia, about $1,000 a week. Now remember, that's an average, so it's distorted upwards by the high earnings at the top end. And so the median, or what the sort of, not quite the most common, but the number in the middle, where we divide the number in half, and the top and the bottom is probably close to 25 or 30. So it's a lot less than $1,000 a week. But remember, to earn $1 million then, let alone to actually have it in the bank as an asset, then would take you 20 years just to earn that amount of money on average weekly earnings in Australia. So $1 billion is 1,000 times more than that. So it gives you some idea how much wealth's involved. And you can see from these distribution statistics, these are Australian wealth distribution statistics, but we can look at it globally, where the assets of 358 billionaires exceed the combined incomes of countries with 45% of the world's people. It's an enormous concentration of wealth globally. We covered this in the earlier lecture, but it was worth going over it again. And what I would argue is that these kind of patterns tell you that there's more going on in class than what is one feels is the case, or what one subjectively reports. There is an objective class structure out there that exists independently of what you think about it. And if you look at that, the top 1% own 20%, 10% own 55%, and so on, then that wealth distribution statistics, and divided it up by, there's about 100 flex students in this course. So if you took $100 and divided it up amongst yourselves, according to the wealth distribution statistics, have a think about how much each person would get. Bring that to the discussion board. So I would say there's a class structure, and that it has objective and subjective elements. Objectively, we can look at the statistics, like there's been a lot of talk in the media recently about this class warfare notion, and Joel Fitzgibbon, who was previously a minister, says that miners in his electorate on $2,400 to $2,800 a week gross are not wealthy, and the media tends to report these subjective accounts rather than saying, well, we could make some objective numbers. We could say that the top 10% of household incomes, that's households, not individuals, net household incomes, in anyone who's earning more than $1,400 a week clear is in the top 10% of incomes in Australia. So that's an objective number you could point to. Average household income in Australia is about $850 a week. So when somebody says that the miners on $2,500 are not wealthy, well, we need to put it in that objective context. Again, there is a subjective element. You can talk about what class you feel like you're in. You can talk about whether you feel like you're wealthy. You can ask people to define it, and people on high incomes said that wealthy was $300,000 plus. Those on low incomes said it was $120,000 plus. So that gives you some idea of of the range of views on what counts as wealthy. Obviously, the higher up you go, the more. But we can fit that into an objective structure. By income, we can measure it by income, or we could measure it by wealth, as we did in the previous slide. So the next thing then is to think about, well, why does this happen? And theories are about in sociology are about generalizable explanations. I mean, why do we get these patterns? And we essentially have two competing explanations. We have a liberal view, and that is to say that change is managed within the existing system and it's focused on individuals. Max Weber is the name most commonly associated with that approach, and his approach has been developed since his work in the 1920s. And the Marxist approach, which goes back even further, he was much closer to the French Revolution. He was writing in the 1850s, 1860s, and so he had his mind on fundamental social change and how systems operated, and that gives rise to very different notions of class. But the notion of class, to both Marx and Weber and most thinkers prior to the modern period, prior to post-war period, was that class was as obvious as the nose on your face, and what you were looking for was a way to explain it. There wasn't any doubt that there was such a thing as class. Now, when I say liberal, I mean liberal individualistic explanations, not liberal party, so don't get confused about that. So for Max Weber uses a common sense notion of class, the sort of one you would have used prior to doing this course, or while you're doing this course. That one is upper, middle, or lower class. And class for Weber is position in the market. You bring a certain asset position to the market, you sell your labour, and the income you get from your labour or from any other assets you're trading, puts you in a certain class bracket. And that's largely a descriptive category. So you can have 7 classes, you can have 10 classes. So it depends on what you're trying to research and what sort of patterns you're trying to find. It impacts on individual life chances, that's their phrase, and social mobility can be measured, but you can have 3 or 7 or 10 classes depending on how you're trying to measure it. In the previous ones, we used quintiles, so we had 20% bands and so on. So we can use different ways. But essentially, what it's the theory behind it is that we start with individuals who compete with each other, and because some individuals are smarter, cleverer than others, they rise to the top, and so we end up on a basis of merit, and so we end up with a hierarchy, and so he has that Protestant ethic thesis that capitalism works by people working hard, and that's how they get rich, and that's how you get a class hierarchy. So for Weber, classes are market relations. It's about exchanging commodities as one axis of power, and he talks about economic assets. There are other axes of power that he's interested in, the status or party. People can get power via a political party or an organised force of some kind, and also they can have power and influence in a society by their ability to consume. So there are different axes of power and in influence, and that's a liberal pluralist notion of power in which people seemingly compete on open terms and for their own interests, and that's what you get, sort of an economic view in the sense that it's very much like the supply and demand models of economics. So people have social mobility, and they act to change their position in pursuit of rational interests, like Adam Smith, the famous economist, and we still have that view very, very similar. The capitalist market is progressive. It's much progressive beyond. It's much more rationalised and merit-based, and progress is measured by an efficient division of labour, whereas for Marx, class relations are relations of exploitation. So it's very different, and he would have regarded any attempt to move beyond capitalism as a return to serfdom or an irrational idea altogether. Of course, there's been a lot of water under the bridge since Weber was writing, and that's people have updated his theories and thought about them more. We still tend to talk about them as competing interest groups, and Weber assumed that people could make their way up that class ladder, and neo-Weberians like Frank Parkin or Anthony Giddens have claimed that capitalism has outgrown the whole notion of economic scarcity that required classes to compete with each other for share in the national wealth, and so people now move on the basis of skill or merit or education, And so Giddens and others have now said that class is a thing of the past, that there are no longer a class structure in society in the way it traditionally was seen, and so there are no economic barriers. There might be social barriers like prejudice or national and cultural barriers or education that hamper people's access to create inequality in the market, or casualised workforce and residual underclass and so on. But those barriers were not the same as they had been in the past with a zero-sum situation. The main competing notion of class is the Marxist one, and this is class here is position in production. And we use this a little bit, but it doesn't have the same explanatory power that Marx gave it. A lot of your interview subjects identified as working class, and that's an important term in Marx's thinking. But for him, it's the owners and non-owners of the means of production. The way a society produces all its goods and services, that's the means of production. In our society, that's factories and wage labour and the boss and the worker in the factory, or the boss and the worker in the office, and so on. An easy way to tell whether you're an owner of the means of production is to ask yourself that if you gave up work and your lifestyle didn't change, then you'd be a capitalist. You'd be living on some sort of money capital that you'd accumulated. So Bill Gates could retire tomorrow to a beach in Florida, and Microsoft would continue turning over, and his asset position would generate more than enough wealth for him to live without ever having to turn up to work on Monday. So he lives off his capital, whereas miners, no matter how wealthy they may be in terms of that weekly income that we talked about a couple of slides ago, if they lose their job at the mine, they're back on the dole queue with everyone else. They might have a little bit of money accumulated, but they'll also have debts, of course. But they might have some money accumulated, but in the long run, they're probably not going to have enough money to live on, aside from their work situation. So rather than being descriptive, Marx's theory attempts to explain why these patterns happen, and he understands capitalism as a system of social relations, and he tries to explain those patterns like the rich get richer. And the categories that he creates to do that are only of interest in relation to social change. He's not interested in just describing what's going on. So it's not a system of understanding people based on their income or occupational lifestyle. That's very much a Weberian. It's not about how much you earn or what car you drive, like it is in the liberal notion. Here it's about people's relationship to the means of production. We did cover this before, but I'll just go over it again. Now, contrary to what most books say, Marx does not have a two-class model. In his writing, there's a three-class model. There's three classes in society: those who get their income from land ownership, so they get rent, and that's how they live. Think of the lords or big landowners like the aristocracy in England. There's people who make their income from capital, from the accumulated money that they've accumulated, so that's a capitalist. And then there's people, the vast majority of people, who make a living from wages, and those people are workers. Now, he understood capitalist societies as being about relations of exploitation. In fact, all societies are about how the surplus gets distributed, if there is one. And so he would say the reason you get the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer is the dynamics of the capitalist system. The workers create more value for the company than they get paid in wages, and so the wealth accumulates at the top. And capitalists may go broke and go to the bottom, but the basic class structure is reproduced by this capacity that workers have to create more value for the firm. And if you think about your work situation, it's clear that the people who are doing the work, the workers in the factory or in the office, must be contributing more value to the firm than they are being paid, otherwise they'd be going broke. And it's this dynamic between the capitalists and the working class, according to Marx, that shapes the whole direction of society. So he said all history is the history of class struggle. That was 1858, and that's the sort of premise that Marx has worked out. Now he's got a sort of scientific view as he understood it, and that was that what you're trying to do in social analysis is discover the sort of laws of motion of the capitalist system, and that one way sort of rings, it's like Einstein or Newton's laws of motion that you're trying to discover, but it is a little bit different in a social system. But that's the kind of mental picture he has of science, but he sees it as developing through contradictions. So rather than a mechanical model like a lot of scientists had it in his day, he said there's a system in operation, and those systems have contradictions in them. That is, they have tensions within them that drive them in different directions, and that's why you get periodical crises that arises, and you have these boom and bust cycles as capitalism tries to adjust to those contradictions. So you get increasing polarisation of wealth and poverty, but in theory increasing awareness of that situation, and the poor and the working class organise to try to improve their position. And he argued that this would lead to another revolution where the great catchphrase of the French Revolution, liberty, equality and fraternity, would be realised on a grand scale. So Marx then interpreted all of history to some extent as being a struggle over creating and owning that social surplus. And this didn't happen in the really, for the most of around my 800 lifetime analogy, but this didn't happen in those societies. But there was in tribal foraging societies where people are living at subsistence level. There's not a lot of surplus, and what there is shared in common. And that's how human beings live for the 650 out of the 800 lifetimes that we've been around on the planet. So that's the if you want to think in terms of human nature, you have to consider that for most of human history we lived in that fashion. But then, in about 10,000 BC or so, we had an agricultural revolution where people settled on the land or in cities and began to grow their own food. And that was a big shift in the way that human beings started to live. And those gave rise to tributary societies where there was a group of people who didn't work and a group of people who tilled the land, and for one means or another paid for this ruling class of some kind or another, whether it's the feudal lord and the peasant, or other forms where tribute is extracted from the people who actually do the work on the land to sustain the king and his retinue and the soldiers and so on that make up the rest of society, and the arts, the craftspeople and stuff like that too. So there's a division within the society between those who own and don't own the land, and who can compel who to work for each other. And then Marx said after 125 lifetimes of that, he didn't say about 125 lifetimes, that's my way of saying it, but after that period there was another revolution, an industrial revolution, in which the class division that emerged out of that was the owners and non-owners of capital, and that's the one we take for granted as sort of a common sense. And that's only been the last 3 or 4 lifetimes out of the 800. And Marx argued that would lead to a workers' revolution, and that there would be another kind of society, a communist society, which would be like the tribal foraging societies. He called those societies primitive communist societies, and what he saw as emerging out of a workers' revolution was an advanced communist society in which everything was owned in common, and in which those who produced the goods would decide about production, and that would be a true democracy. It's these contradictions that throw the system into crisis, the sort of contradictions between an individual and their class position. So the individual capitalist wants to pay his workers as little as possible in order to maximise his profit or her profit. But they also want the workers as a whole to consume more, so that he can sell those products to somebody. So there's a contradiction we see in the media, we're exhorted to tighten our belts and not make unrealistic wage demands, but at the same time to consume more, and that's led to a massive increase in profit in the last period, and also debt, as that money is recycled back as credit cards and stuff. So historically what it's led to is a series of boom and bust cycles as the system extracts as much as it can, and then it reaches a point where it's simply producing far too much to sell, and then the whole thing reverts to zero. And we've seen that in the Great Depression, one of the biggest. We saw it most recently in the global financial crisis, where the assets are completely overinflated compared to what they're really worth, and it reverts to zero, and there's a massive crisis in the system. More recently, we've come to think of the ecological crisis, and that capitalism is a system of infinite growth. It requires a minimum of 3% per growth per year, every year. So 3% this year, and 3% of that 3% next year, and 3% of that 3% the year after. So it's an exponential growth. And the ecological movement, the green movement, has made us more and more aware of the limits to a finite planet, even if it's not quite as finite as we thought. Clearly we are reaching some serious rifts in the way natural cycles are understood, and global warming being the key one, where we're beginning to the carbon pollution from our industrial processes is beginning to heat the planet up, and that's going to have long-term consequences. But that's the carbon cycle that's being interfered with. But there are other cycles also that are impacted by capitalism, water cycles and nitrogen cycles. And capitalism is a very linear, straightforward, exponential system, whereas nature works much more cyclically and in those sort of patterns. Marxism doesn't ignore other struggles like women's rights and gay rights and black rights. It's critical of liberal and individualistic interpretations and seeks to bring a class lens to those questions, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Of course, lots has changed since the 1880s, and the capitalism that Marx is looking at looked a lot more like, say, China does now, with a highly authoritarian, undemocratic state with no unions and award rates, and workers don't have a vote, and we've also seen the rise of managers. And in his day, most companies, the boss, the owner was actually in the factory rather than some anonymous board of shareholders or anonymous CEO who was essentially a manager managing the capital of the firm on behalf of the actual owner, and the owners are all other shareholders, so it's much more a very different system. Of course, he was wrong. There wasn't the workers' revolution didn't occur in the way that he thought it would. Where they did occur, they were in third world situations, and when they did, they didn't lead to a ideal communist society by any stretch of the imagination. And so, we need to think about how those impact on the theory. And I've talked about the global financial crisis. I mean, how do you want to explain that by saying it's just about individual greed, that the system, this is the dominant liberal interpretation, or do you want to look at it more systematically in the way that Marx does? Likewise, the global ecological crisis. Some of the most recent work on the structure, Eric Olin Wrights looked at, maybe we could talk about four classes. You've got big capitalists and small capitalists, and they've got their dynamics, and then you've got managers and workers and maybe small farmers. So you can think about how those dynamics might operate. But the really question of whether this is relevant or not is determined by what you get from the analysis. So if you looked, and I did mention this before too as well, have a look at David Harvey's work on geography of capital and the global financial crisis, or Manuel's work on world systems theory, or Jason Moore and John Bellamy Foster on Marxism and ecology. Rick Wolff talks about the global financial crisis in a Marxist sense, and there's journals like Monthly Review that you can look up Marxist analysis in and say, well, does this make more sense than the sort of other interpretations that I've heard? And that's the touchstone at the end of the day. Okay, so this is part B of lecture 7, and we're looking at the sociology of health and illness, or what you might call unnatural causes. But to get your head around how we're coming at this, I just wanted to give you a bit of an exercise to think about. What are the 4 major causes of death in Australia? Or 5. There are of course age factors. Naturally, degenerative diseases happen the older you get. There are genetic factors. If you're more likely to have a heart attack if your parents had heart attacks when they died. Now that's a statistical number that is generated out of large population research, which says that you have a 25% greater chance of having a heart attack if your parents had a heart attack. That doesn't necessarily translate into you individually, but we're talking about population research in those things, and we tend to regard those factors as genetic, but of course they're also the fact you came up in the same family and had a similar family background, class background and so on. But if we looked at the 5 big killers in Australia, and these are gendered too, but let's have a look at the main ones, and then we asked ourselves, well, what are the main causes of these problems? Heart disease, stroke, lung cancer. Basically, smoking is a serious risk factor in the top 3, and for the others, diet and exercise, or being overweight, or sedentary lifestyle, however you want to frame it. I just pulled these off the net just quickly. So what sort of solutions do you think of when you think of those sorts of problems? And we'll come back to that, so just put that in your back of your mind about, okay, what are the solutions to our main killers in Western society? So go back and have a look too at the wealth distribution statistics from your notes of part 1. If 98% of the wealth in Australia is owned by the top half of wealth holders, and if billionaires own half the wealth of the world, 358 people own half the wealth. What do you think's the effect there's going to be on your health? What's the social construct that will emerge out of that? Look at this diagram. This is from the earlier edition of John Germold's book Second Opinion on page 28, and you can see here that they've got men and women, lung cancer rates and quintiles are 20% bands for each set of income. Right? So the top number is taken as the 0 point, the top 20% of income earners, and then as we go down the hierarchy for each 10%, each 20% band, each quintile as it's called, you can see how the rate changes. For men and women in lung cancer, diabetes, heart disease, influenza. And influenza, notice that these ones at the bottom are starting to go off the chart, so they've had to break it up. Bronchitis and emphysema, a little bit different for men and women there. Traffic accidents. All of these things then are distributed by class. So the wealthiest suffer the least. Not always, there's some variations across the genders, but in general we can see there are gendered patterns and there are class patterns. There is more of it the lower down the chart you go. For traffic accidents, bronchitis, and of course suicide. So I encourage you to read that chapter in John Germold's book, the earlier edition of Second Opinion, yes. So in terms of straight numbers, if you take the bottom and the top 20%, you've got a 265% greater rate of pneumonia and influenza and a 300% greater rate for women between the top and the bottom income group. So you're twice as likely or 3 times as likely to get pneumonia or influenza. In lung cancer, but in the top and the bottom, you're 55% more likely to get lung cancer if you're in the lower income group. Bronchitis and emphysema is 100%, nearly 100% greater for men and about 30%, 39% greater for women. Heart disease is 50% greater for men and 124% greater for women across the income. Diabetes is double for women and about 75% for men. And even suicide is 75% greater for men in the lower classes and 48% greater for women in the lower classes. So health is a distribution like wealth. It's distributed in the same way that income is. In generally speaking, the lower your class, the higher your mortality and morbidity. Overall burden of illness, as they call it, is 32 times higher if you're in the lowest quintile than if you're in the highest. Now there's a lot of reasons for that. It's not just straightforwardly you earn more money, but it'll relate to the kinds of pollution you're exposed to, the kinds of work you have to do. I mean, I'm much less great at risk of getting injured at work here in my office than I am if I work on a building site, so that's going to be different. But there'll be cultural factors as well. The working class and the middle class have different ideas about food and about leisure and about entertainment, all of which predisposes them in different ways to different kinds of illness and disease. But what is clear, though, is this isn't about individual choices, that there are social patterns. I mean, if it were just about individual choices, then you'd expect to find that doctors and nurses are the most healthy since they're the most informed about their choices, but of course they're not. Health in a capitalist society, as we talked about before, is a commodity. And like any commodity, it's a commodity-driven system. And unlike previous systems, which were needs-driven systems, people produced what they had, produced what they did in order to survive and to pay tribute to the Lord, if there was one. But essentially it's a system of subsistence, whereas capitalism is a system of commodity production. We produce things in order to make a profit, the capitalist class does, and we work in order to get the money we need to buy the things we need. We don't actually produce the things that we own and then sell on. So given that we've got a bit of a sense of what capitalism is like as a system, hopefully you're starting to see some of the contours of it. What sort of model of health would you expect? What would it focus on? Would it be focused on prevention or would it be focused on cure? Who would be seen as responsible for health outcomes? Would it be the community or the individual, and why would that be? So when we look at capitalism and health, we can see there are two major concerns. One is that it's profit-driven and illness-focused. There's no profit in prevention. and fee for service. That's how it's decided. So you go to the doctor, you pay a fee for the service. There are drug companies that need to sell more drugs. There are machine companies that need to produce high-tech machinery. So there's a whole bunch of large companies who have an interest in making a profit out of health, and so they do that by increasing their market share and competing with each other to create bigger and bigger markets. Also, there's the issue of lifestyle under capitalism. So it's a high stress lifestyle. There are industrial injuries in factory consumption, and then we also have sort of overconsumption and in the West, and underconsumption or starvation on a global scale. So we look at the lifestyle issues. It's interesting to look at, say, Raj Patel's work. He wrote a famous book called Stuffed and Starved, describing this division in the world food system between starvation, which is being caused by food overproduction in the third world, more food than they can sell at a profit. So Indian capitalists will export food. It doesn't make any difference that people are starving in India, because their job is to produce food for a profit, not to meet the needs of people. And Sharma has written a nice piece here. You can click on that URL for Western cows and Eastern farmers, in which he argues that the 1.2 billion cows in the West are far better treated than the 1.2 billion Eastern farmers who try to make a living from their small farms. On the other hand, in the West, we just got those list of diseases, and many of them are caused by overconsumption and consumption of fast food and high-fat food and that sort of thing. So accidents are blamed on accident proneness in individuals. Of course, being overweight is simply seen as a matter of choice. You're not choosing to eat the right things. These same arguments were, of course, made for smoking in a previous generation, that smokers had the right to smoke, or that people had the choice to smoke, never mind that it was addictive, or never mind about the way in which food consumption is shaped by social options. People are working longer hours, they're subject to more stress, there's all sorts of time shifting. I'm recording this lecture late at night because I can do that on my laptop at home, so I'll just get it out of the way now, after I've written the lecture. So I'm working beyond the standard 9 to 5, and they're all seen as my personal choice or my personal problem. So as I said, it's profit driven and illness focused. It's industrial medicine, or Kentucky Fried Medicine. Someone made a documentary called Kentucky Fried Medicine. It promotes drugs. There's $30,000 per doctor is made out of drugs, and high-tech machines that fill the hospitals are seen as cutting-edge medicine and as high-tech medicine. And while health has improved over the century, very little can be attributed to high-technology medicine. The sort of high-profile, high-tech medicine has not contributed a great deal to improved health outcomes. Overwhelmingly, it's improved diet, improved hygiene, washing of hands, immunisation on a large scale. So those are not specifically medical interventions, but they're population level interventions that cause those changes. And you think of the potential damage that can be done by modern medicine in ways that are quite extraordinary. And one of the recent ones was the Vioxx scandal. And again, here you had Merck. It had produced a drug that was used produced for one purpose, I'm not quite recall, but then it was being used as a heart medication, a heart blood pressure medication, as this was seen a bit trying to expand the market into other things. You can only sell it for one, but they can sell it for other illnesses. And then they made about $2.5 billion out of this medication before it was realised it was actually causing heart attacks. And so even though, of course, again, it's a population measure, a statistical measure to say this caused 100,000 more heart attacks than would otherwise have occurred if people hadn't been using this medication, and yet these sort of scandals are scarcely known. Imagine if a terrorist set off a bomb and killed 100,000 people, there'd be an uproar. But a medical company like Merck, a drug company like Merck, can have these outcomes. They'll have to pay damages eventually to the various people, but that's pretty cold comfort to the people who have died and their families. So here's another question. Perhaps you've seen a food pyramid, with 6 to 11 servings of bread and fruit and meat and fats and oils. What's this based on? I mean, first we might question as sociologists why you would ask the US Department of Agriculture to put your food pyramid together for you. I mean, given that the role of the Department of Agriculture is to promote the consumption of food, then that might be said to say that they have some conflict of interest. And it's not surprising, I think, then that the two largest food producers, the dairy and the meat industries, have a group of their own. This isn't based on any particular science. It's based on consumption levels, and these pyramids are seen as things that can be used to promote consumption. So in Australia, when recent food pyramid was released, it was said that you should eat less high fat meat. But there was such a backlash from the meat industry saying, well, you can't tell people to have less, and so it became eat more lean meat. So that was the way it's framed is to promote consumption. If you're interested, you can have a look at it. Since we've been playing around with that matrix idea, there's a little sort of parody there about the food industry called the Matrix. You might want to have a look at. So a healthy diet in a capitalist culture is broken down into the smallest parts and sold to you as separate bits. Whereas healthy diets are not about individual items or individual nutrients like proteins, fats and carbohydrates. We know from that earlier slide that we need to be eating less saturated fat. So how would you do that? Well, one of the ways you could do that was to stop people eating meat. So, what does the research say about vegetarian diets? Well, big studies of vegetarian diets, usually there was one done in Oxford in England on vegetarians. There was 11,000 subjects in the study, so it's a very large study, half on the usual meat diet and another half on the vegetarian diet, and they found that vegetarians had 40% less cancer, 30% less heart disease, and 20% less likely to die before the age of 80. It's a really clear study that more plant protein is much better for you. The China Health Study, now this was a larger scale one again, 6,500 people, and what they were able to do in this one was to actually detail the effects of increasing meat consumption as China has become wealthier. They've come over to more Western diets in some parts, and so as their consumption of meat increased, we could then track the effect that had on their health. And what the China Health Study found is a direct correlation between the increase in meat consumption and the increase in heart disease and cancer. These are quite clear, and the guy who ran that study, Colin Campbell, said that there's no chemical carcinogen nearly so important in causing human cancer as animal protein. Now, of course, there would be cultural resistance to everybody becoming a vegetarian. I'm not saying you should or you shouldn't. I'm just pointing out these health results. But a question we have to ask is, why is this not well known? Why is it not even mentioned in health advice when clearly straightforward research when we looked at those things on causes would, based on these studies, then we'd promote the following food pyramid based on 4 instead of 5 food groups, and they would be fruit, legumes, whole grains and vegetables. And we could, if you go on the Physicians Committee for Responsible Eating website, you can see how they spell it out in terms of servings, which actually makes a lot more sense based on the research. We'd also need to do something about sedentary lifestyles. We need to promote cycling and walking to the shop, alternative means of transport. We ban smoking, of course, which is well on the way to happening. And the thing to notice is that all of that would massively improve our health at a population level and has very little to do with hospitals and the medical model. So in sociology, we look at a social or community model of health. We look for social rather than individual causes. We tend to talk about things like depression as personal problems or as some sort of, as an epidemic of personal problems rather than looking at social causes. We can see, even just at the brief glance that we've looked at, that health is connected to class and race and gender. And what we want to do really is, to move away from the sort of natural causes model to the unnatural causes, the historical and cultural causes of illness. And in part 3, we'll have a bit more look at the biomedical model and processes of medicalisation, the issue of suicide. Okay, so the biomedical model in part C of the lecture is the common sense model of the capitalist system. It sees disease as a biological breakdown in individuals with a specific cause and a specific treatment, and this of course is the basis on which commodification can occur. It's reductionist, so the patient tends to be reduced to their symptoms, which is another way of commodifying the patient as something that can be processed through the system as a commodity within the hospital system, and diseases are commodified, and they can then be given specific treatments, and particularly drug treatments. It locates the problem in the individual and tends to blame the victim, although it's supposed to be value-free and neutral. And it medicalises issues to create clients, so perfectly natural conditions like childbirth or old age are then medicalised to such an extent that they are seen as illnesses in and of themselves. So there's a treatment focus then for the biomedical model, and technical solutions are seen as the solution, the sort of magic bullet approach. There are big pharmaceutical companies that produce illnesses for which they then have the cure. High cholesterol, menopause, high blood pressure, social anxiety disorder are seen as clinical conditions. So where once you grew up you were a shy person, now you can be diagnosed with social anxiety disorder. Once upon a time people were drunks, but now that's become medicalised as alcoholism. So you have those processes by which aspects of life fall more and more under medical categories, and this has led to recent disputes around the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the latest edition 5, which even the psychiatric community is concerned about the expansion of categories. We can see this with things like ADHD. It's a chemical intervention. Troublesome children are labelled as hyperactive, although the normative structure for that's not spelt out. It's medicalised as, once they were called hyperactive when I was growing up, now it's medicalised as attention deficit disorder, or ADHD. The solution then is some kind of Ritalin, which is a amphetamine derivative. It's a Schedule 2 drug which, according to some, triggers serious side effects similar to cocaine, and yet if anyone was to suggest we should give amphetamines to children there'd be an uproar, but when it's medicalised and diagnosed and treated it's seen as less problematic. There are various critiques of this material. National Institute of Health Consensus Development Conference and the American Academy of Pediatrics found that there was no biological basis for ADHD and therefore no biological basis for a treatment of it. And yet in 1985 there were 500,000 children in the United States diagnosed and treated with Ritalin for ADHD, and by 2002 it was 5 to 7 million. So you can see that incredible expansion of categories. And when you look at suicide and bring some of that sort of critique of medicine, the connections to capitalism and so on, to suicide specifically, now this is your job to do the research, but I'm just trying to sketch it out for you. In the history we could look at what the different ways that suicide has been seen historically and not immediately treated as a sort of medical condition or a clinical condition or even indeed a problem. There are taboos around death which make suicide difficult to discuss in our society, and issues around, say, assisted suicide and euthanasia. If you attempt to take your own life, that's actually a crime. Of course, if you successfully complete, well, there's no one to prosecute. But in cases of euthanasia or assisted suicide, where you assist a loved one in attempting to commit suicide, if they succeed and they can prove that you were involved in assisting that suicide, you'll have committed a murder. Obviously that's premeditated, so a very serious offence. What are the common sense notions in the culture around suicide? They're the sort of things we always like to challenge. The idea that the talkers never do it, is one cultural common sense about suicide. That it's a cry for help. There's some truth to those sorts of constructions, but to a very large extent, it's a minimisation of the experience. We need to think about how is this connected to a biomedical model. We tend to think of it as a clinical disorder rather than a social problem. Suicide is a social construct. It's not just sort of out there. At one time, in Japanese culture, committing suicide was seen as an honourable thing to do in certain situations. We don't have that set of cultural codes. So when we look at its patterns and its meanings, we have to think about them as social constructs. The biomedical model is overwhelmingly the dominant model when it comes to looking at suicide. It's seen as an outgrowth of depression, which some people have described as the medicalisation of sorrow. It's taken to be a private trouble, or as a chemical imbalance in the brain, even though there is no test for the chemical imbalance. There's it's assumed that if the drugs have some impact, then it must be correcting the chemical imbalance. But you don't, when you're diagnosed with depression, you don't do a test for the chemical imbalance and then get treated for it. The recent disputes that I mentioned in DSM-5 have been around the issue of grief, for instance. It was always regarded as a normal characteristic to grieve for somebody who died, and that was taken into account in previous diagnoses by saying, 12-month period of grieving is normal, and so you couldn't be diagnosed with clinical depression or endogenous depression in that period. But that's recently in DSM-5 is to be dropped. So of course there's that market of expansion and inflation of categories. In Australia in 1990 there were 5 million scripts for depression. In 1998 it was 8.2 million, and in 2004 there were 12 million scripts written for depression. 250,000 of those were for teenagers, even though there is no scripted drug that's regarded as safe for teenagers in the medical literature. So when we look at suicide then, what are the class, race and gender patterns? Well, we saw in that previous slide from John Gurmov's book that between the top and bottom income brackets, the suicide rate is 70% higher for men and 46% higher for women, whether you're in the top percentile or the bottom quintile. Gender, it's men complete suicide more often, but women attempt more. You'll have to go and check these figures. These are the ones that I've known for some time. The Indigenous rate of suicide is 7 times the national average. It would also vary by age, and we're generally more concerned with young people in our culture, so youth suicide is seen as a particular problem. Young male suicide in rural areas was seen as a problem. I think it's less of an issue these days. Suicide in the elderly is not uncommon either, but they're not regarded as having the same value culturally as youth, and so it's not seen in quite the same way. And the question is, how can any of this be explained by a biomedical model? Well, I don't think it can. I mean, biology plays a role in everything, but in terms of these patterns, I don't think you can, attribute it to individual biological differences. So we look at a social model. Classic studies here by Durkheim showed that suicide was correlated with things like your religious beliefs, your marital status, your gender, your education. And so his argument was that the kinds of social interconnections that you had, how well integrated you were into a community, how much you felt part of that community, had a big influence on whether or not you'd be likely to commit suicide or not. So it's not just individual factors. We have to recognise there are serious questions about the biological basis for depression and limits to the sort of magic bullet thinking of prescribing a drug or even individual counselling. That what's causing these problems is a much broader set of social patterns, and while of course drugs and counselling may have their place, it's important to recognise that the importance of social connections and social constructions and how we think about these things. Thanks a lot. See you next week.